Good morning, everybody. I'm Gwen Chapman. I'm the Dean of Social and Applied Human Sciences here at the University of Guelph, and I'm delighted to welcome people to the first in our COVID-19 series of webinars. This one is looking at COVID-19 and food security, the intersection. And I'm really pleased to have a wide variety of people joining us today in what I'm sure is going to be a really stimulating discussion. Black Lives Matter. June is Indigenous History Month, and June is Pride Month. These statements are important to today's conversation and about food security, which is often more of a challenge for racialized and other minority groups. The same systems that can cause food insecurity for these communities often also result in COVID-19 hitting many of those same communities harder. So the intersection of COVID and food security affects different people, communities, and industries in different ways, which is why we have assembled such a diverse set of speakers for today's discussion. So I'm very pleased to welcome today's panelists, who are Letitia Diawu. Letitia, want to give us a little wave, who is the Black Creek Community Farm from the director of the Black Creek Community Farm, and winner of the 2018 Errol Community Food Hero Award. Also, Elizabeth Finnis, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. Robert Friendship, who is a professor in the Department of Population Medicine. And Arvinder Pannu, who is a Master of Science candidate in the Capacity Development and Extension Program, again at the University of Guelph. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to talk about the food security challenges that they think the people sort of in the groups that they work with are experiencing. So I'm going to start with Beth. So Beth, what COVID-19 food security challenges do you think that small-scale family farmers might be experiencing?
Thanks so much, Gwen, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion today. I just want to put my comments in context. So most recently, I've been working with smaller scale family farmers in the Parry Sound district, which is just on the edge of Northern Ontario. And I've been looking at food production, local food production challenges and innovations. So this is not what is typically considered a core farming area, but it does support dairy, market garden, and livestock farms. And most of these are small or medium scale mixed use farms, relying on farmers markets and farm gate sales and on family and local labor. So I'm drawing on this work to frame most of my comments today. A lot of what smaller scale family farmers are facing right now is going to be shaped by the factors that they are embedded within. So things like their locations, their specific markets, and their overall access to resources, both the sort of general agricultural resources and the resources that are going to help them adapt to the pandemic context. So for example, in the Parry Sound district, farmers experience a number of pre-existing challenges, including marketing issues, limited resources, climate and geographical challenges, aging farming populations, and land pressures, particularly in terms of tourism and recreation development. So COVID-19 is adding another layer to this because it is further affecting their marketing options, the connections that they have with customers, their access to key supply chains like feed, animal feed, and so on, and the ability to get support and resources in a timely manner. Moreover, some of these farms are quite isolated and quite difficult to physically get to. So while there are some new online sales options in the area, including through local farmers markets and social media marketing, there are actually still places where people have very slow or non-existent internet, making these kinds of alternate marketing routes inaccessible for some people. And for parts of the Parry Sound district, one of the key markets is tourists, specifically people who come up to cottages or rental cabins or provincial parks, and they pick up the produce, meat, and eggs that local farmers sell on the way to their destinations, and then they pick it up again on their way home. And this influx of tourists represents an important income an important source of farm income. And the reduced tourism that we're seeing now and also likely to continue to see for a while means increased economic pressures for farmers.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to turn it over to Bob now. Your area of expertise and interest is the swine industry and consumers of their products. So what do you see as the food security challenges relating to COVID-19 in those areas?
Yes, so maybe I'd like to start by just thanking all the farmers. They sometimes get missed out when they're listing essential workers, and there's nothing more essential than farmers. Yeah, so in the swine industry is a nice contrast with what Beth was saying about the small holding of small farmers. The swine industry is large, and it's a mature industry that has, very sophisticated infrastructure, and yeah, it's different, I think, than some of the other supply management sectors like dairy and poultry. The swine industry is really free enterprise and competes, in the world market. 65% of the pork produced in Canada is exported, which becomes a problem when borders are closed and trade is disrupted. And the other aspect to the pig industry is that it's very tightly tied with the US industry, much like the automobile industry is, where parts go back and forth before, the car is assembled. Pigs go back and forth, feed goes back and forth, parts of pigs go back and forth. So we're things that happen in the US really affect, Canada. And the challenges that Canadian pork producers are facing, one is low prices. They are terrible financial problems because of COVID-19, and a lot of this is related to the packing industry that has been exposed as a weak link in the food chain. That if a packing plant closes, it creates a lot of stresses to where the producers are going to send their pigs. And so on top of poor prices, the producers are just worried about not being able to even market their pigs. Yeah, I think it's been a very stressful time for them. And then they face also the same issues that everybody else is trying to keep their business going during this time, worrying about what happens if they get sick or their family or some of the workers. How do you keep everybody isolated and healthy? And that's probably one of the strengths of the pig industry is they understand biosecurity. They I think very quick to adopt ways to try and keep farms running and keep everybody safe. And it's meant changing things a little bit with the way they do procedures and lunchrooms, etc. But just I guess a very challenging time for the pig industry and pig farmers, and I think that that's probably shared in other agricultural sectors. It's just that's the group that I know about.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to turn to Letitia now, and maybe a bit more of a focus on consumers and urban food production. Also, particularly the Black community and Toronto. What is your sense of COVID-19 related food security challenges that you're seeing?
Thank you so much for having me today. It is no surprise that Black racialized communities, when the City of Toronto shared the COVID map, it was no surprise that racialized and Black communities had high rates of COVID. So Black people are on the front lines in terms of, if you look at the farms across Southern Ontario, racialized people are on the front lines of that. Racialized people are on the front lines in terms of senior care homes. They're also in the front lines in terms of the grocery stores. They're in the front lines in terms of all of these work. And during COVID is when people are realizing that these are essential work and these are essential services that we need within our community. So you can imagine sort of what the challenges that our communities had before and the challenges that our communities will be facing now. And it's very much tied to, you know, the systemic inequities that we're facing. So if the Black Creek Community Farm, when we started the emergency food program, very quickly the numbers grew to over 2,500 people who are, you know, seeking support and seeking food needs for their families, because our communities, again, are the ones on the front lines, are the ones that are impacted most by COVID. They're also the ones that are low paid, right? And get paid really, really low wages. So in terms of what's happening within our communities is no different in terms of what was happening before COVID, except with COVID now, the issues, of course, have is at a higher proportion. So part of this is really looking at, you know, some of the gains that we made during COVID with some, for instance, the danger pay. How do we ensure that that danger pay is also increased for people post-COVID as well? Thanks.
Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Arvinder. And what can you tell us sort of from a student perspective?
So let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Arvinder, and I'm a student, a candidate of a master's candidate in capacity development extension. I've done a lot of extracurriculars around my campus. I worked for University's Fighting World Hunger, where I did bi-weekly lectures for students teaching them about food security. So I'm going to start off by, you know, explain what food security is. Well, it's based on 3 pillars, and that's food access, food availability, and food adequacy. And it's always been a problem. COVID-19 has, you know, just compounded itself on top of this problem. COVID-19 did not create food insecurity, but it made it worse for marginalized communities on the periphery or edge of the system. So that includes indigenous populations on and off reserves, rural communities. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can check out R2B2 project. Senior citizens in old age homes and hospitals. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go check out Alan Lazan's research on that. At-risk youth, people with disabilities, and especially our homeless communities. But the thing is, the list goes on. So in terms of a student perspective, we're not just millennials running out of baking supplies. No. We're, you know, some of us are actually having to travel long distances for food. We don't have cars. Sometimes there's no bus routes. So these regions are called food deserts, where there's limited access to fresh produce. And where I study at the University of Guelph, there are many organizations that are helping to alleviate this problem. One organization is called The Seed, which has mobile food markets on a sliding scale. There's also a cool initiative started up by Andrew Nixon, Zero Grocery, which is a e-commerce website where you can order online groceries where there's zero waste. The thing is, not every community is fortunate enough to have these kinds of communities. Where my parents live in Brampton, Etobicoke, North York, students are having to travel long distances for food. They're carrying these white, heavy grocery bags in the heat, the rain, the cold, and that's after working sometimes 8 to 10 hour shifts, right? And I can attest to this because my cousin just immigrated from India to go to school here, and she's going through the same kind of ordeal. So students, we're under financial stress. We have tighter budgets. It's teaching us how to stretch our dollar, which is a good thing. But when you run out of money to pay for rent, pay for essential goods, buy baby formula, the picture becomes a lot clearer that, you know, there are some issues in our food system. We're also under many cultural, institutional, and societal pressures, which is all impacting our mental health, which is even worse, you know, within the indigenous population, indigenous students. And there's a lot bigger of a conversation that needs to go on in that realm of things as well. But at the University of Guelph, you know, it has helped a lot of us, but that's because everything is done in-house with hospitality services. The thing is, not every university is a food university. That being said, there's a lot of students who are falling through the cracks and slipping through the cracks, sorry, pardon my language. One example being international students. Their tuition prices are higher. They have limited social capital. In other words, they don't have as many friends and families to rely on if something goes wrong. They also don't get CESB, which is a really, you know, important thing to just, you know, understand and look at. They don't get those same kind of, you know, privileges that we as Canadians do. And if you didn't know, last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, 18,000 kilos of food was shipped to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia from Toronto to support international students. All I can say is that it's not just a student problem. It's impacting many marginalized communities within the food system. And, you know, we should be investing in our students because that's basically us investing in the future.
Thank you. And that's, you know, between all of the panelists, it's been a great overview of the variety of ways in which COVID-19 is affecting the food system, from the producers through to consumers and various vulnerable groups, particularly on the consumer side. So that's sort of what's happening now and what some of the impacts are. What can we think about in terms of the future? So what does all of this mean for the future? And maybe I'll start with you, Letitia, in terms of where you see sort of this going.
Well, I think if we don't address the inequities within the system, the future will not look any different from COVID and pre-COVID. So I think in terms of, for us to look at the future, we must look at the past and look at what's happening during COVID, and really look at policies that, equitable policies that really support migrant farm workers, that support people that work in the hospitality and food industry, people that work in hospitals, so from nurses, PSW workers, to really frontline staff. We really need to look at the whole food system and look at the inequities within the food system and really push for policies to change that. Because if we don't do that, I don't think there will be a post-COVID. It would just literally just going back into the way that things were. And we honestly cannot go back to that way, because we know that the way that the system is set up, the system is set up to kill people, like literally. And people are dying with issues that we can fix. So for an instance, if we look at the migrant farm worker program, we knew they were coming, we knew about COVID. Why was there not enough plans made to house people safely, right? And that's because we don't value the people that are actually using their labor to do the work to make sure that we have food in our fridge to eat. So I think in terms of looking at the future, it's saying that enough is enough. Is making sure that there are huge systemic changes made to make sure that people have access to good, healthy, culturally appropriate food, but also that people's labor is also compensated, and compensated well. If they're essential workers now, they should be essential workers post-COVID. If we're giving them danger pay, it doesn't mean even if COVID is gone, that danger is gone. And we need to recognize that, and we need to make sure that we're putting in all the policies and systems and regulations in place to make sure that people have, of course, a healthy, affordable access to food, but also the work safety, which is really, really important.
Thank you. Arvinder, how about you? What do you see as happening or needed for the future?
So currently students are faced with new challenges, a new system that we're going to need to learn how to navigate, and new demands from the public. I think that all students in the field of food and ag, especially capacity development and extension students, we're all well positioned to support and find solutions for food insecurity problems. We now have the opportunity to learn, innovate, create, and act to make our food system better. And throughout these last couple of months, I've actually seen a lot of interesting initiatives pop up. And I'm just gonna list a few of them to just show you that, there is a lot happening right now, and show the more optimistic end of this. So I could quickly talk a little bit about the Seed, which is a social enterprise that has these mobile food markets set up throughout the community, throughout the Guelph community, all on a sliding scale. And they're also now shipping and delivering food boxes and food boxes to individuals. I also saw a rise of online farmers markets, and that's happening. A lot of that's happening in British Columbia and also here in Ontario as well. There's been a lot of conversations about AI, e-commerce, marketing, and to give you a quick little story, while working this past semester, I worked for the hospitality services marketing team, and I was doing marketing and also developing websites for my professor. I saw a brand new market being created by small scale farmers that Elizabeth was talking about, needing these services of website development and coding. So I taught myself how to, a few friends of mine and I got together, we learned how to code, we learned how to develop websites. And now we're kind of, dabbling in this world and this new field. And we're just kind of, exploring. It's all a process. There's a lot of challenges, but it's very, it's quick. There's a lot of information being thrown at us. I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast. I just talk a lot and talk fast. Sorry about that. But yeah, there's a lot of cool podcasts being created right now. There's a lot of ways that students can be creative. The Feed 9 Billion program has a few cool podcasts out. There's been gardening kits being delivered at homes in Alberta. But the thing is, yes, there are a lot of new opportunities. But the thing is, there's still much more to be done. We can't forget why we're having this conversation. We need to start investing in our communities. We need to start working with interdisciplinary teams with like a systems lens. We can't alter the past, but we need to learn from it, reconcile with what's happened, pay reparations if we have to, and create basically a brighter future.
Great, thank you. So Beth, how about you? What do you see as what this means for the future, particularly for the small family farmers?
So unfortunately, in terms of the farmers that I work with, I suspect that COVID-19 may end up being the last straw for some of them, in the same sense that bovine spongiform encephalitis or mad cow was the last straw for some farmers in the area in the early 2000s. And what this did was, farms closed down. It created a contraction of the agricultural landscape in the Parry Sound district. So unfortunately, I think that our current situation may result in some farmers closing down operations or possibly reducing some of the diversity of what they produce. It may mean that some of their lands get sold for recreational or other uses, given the high demand in the district for that kind of land use. And that will result in further shrinking of local food production in the district. And although there's a lot of diversity in the agricultural sector, I suspect that we will also see some of this in other parts of Ontario and in other parts of Canada. So this is likely to put further pressures on farm sustainability, agricultural biodiversity, and people's ability to purchase locally produced foods and exercise choice in their local food systems, which then contributes to food insecurity more broadly. That said, I do think we're also seeing some potential for positive shifts, and I like to also try and look at the positive elements of this. And as Arvinder mentioned, this idea of ordering online from a local producer, an online order that can be delivered or picked up from the farm gate or picked up from an open air farmer's market, I think is becoming increasingly attractive when people are concerned about shopping indoors. And if this becomes a norm for more people now, then it could remain so in the future, which I think means the potential for farmers to engage with new and expanded customer bases, as well as a sort of broadening of demand for food that is produced and consumed locally, and that isn't transported as far or for as long. This, I think, may encourage some farmers, smaller scale farmers especially, to expand the nature of what they produce, and it may also create spaces for new farmers, which is important. And more broadly, given what we've seen lately in terms of outbreaks on large farms in Ontario, this situation is, as Letitia has pointed out, creating additional pressures to confront and address long-standing critiques of the working and living conditions for some seasonal agricultural workers.
Thank you. Bob, how about you? What do you see as the future with the swine industry?
Well, what COVID-19 is doing to the swine industry is creating a great deal of financial stress on them, and I think maybe other farms as well. And this is not just the the small local farms that Beth was talking about, but these are large family farms that are very specialized and have a great deal of investment and employees and service people, feed mills and other farms growing crops for them. So there's a huge ripple effect that a lot of jobs and I think because of whatever, like whenever there's these types of crises that occur, farmers will go bankrupt. Farmers will leave the sector, and I think people have been emphasizing growing local and all of this, but I think Canada has this very large landmass with a relatively small population, and I think we have a moral obligation to grow food for the world, and exporting food and supplying food needs, I think, is really important. And an industry like the pork industry, it's more than just making sure we have enough food for ourselves, but it is a way of sending food to lots of other countries. And right now I worry about the state of the industry and the financial issues, and but also has been brought up not just the farm workers, but workers in abattoirs and processing areas, that there's weakness here that I think we knew before, and it's been more clearly identified, and so we need to be addressing that and moving ahead, taking this as an opportunity as well as a very severe challenge, and trying to straighten some of this out. And maybe also working out some of the issues with our, interconnection with the United States and our reliance on goodwill and things running smoothly in other countries. Frustrating when the challenges aren't part of something that you have control over and can fix within your own house, I think is an issue. But that's fine.
Thank you. You've all been giving us lots to think about. We're going to have one more round of questions with the panel, and we'll be following that with the Q&A from the people who are listening in. So if you're out there, if you want to start thinking about some questions that you might have and use the Q&A box, you can start sending questions in anytime for the panelists to answer after we get through our last round of their comments. You've all certainly given us lots to think about and really pointed out a number of the vulnerabilities in the whole food system, from the economic vulnerabilities of food producers, the weaknesses in that food production system, whether it's the migrant farm workers, the people working in large farms or in the meat packing plants, consumers who are struggling with their own economic situation, such as students, such as members of other vulnerable and marginalized communities. You've talked a bit about the future, but I'm wondering if on our last round, you could talk a little bit about some specifics about what you would like to see and what are some steps, maybe some specific steps that you think that we might be able to take to get there. So Bob, I'll start with you this time.
Okay, I think what I would like to see is certainly government support for farmers in general that makes sure that this cash flow problem, that people aren't losing their farms over something that like COVID-19 that they had no control over, and I think it means guaranteeing some loans and encouraging them to carry on, because for instance, in the pig industry, things look very promising for the Canadian industry, that there's a real world shortage of pigs, pork right now, that countries like China have been devastated with disease problems, African swine fever, and there's this huge shortage. And I think that support, financial support, and I think we can also take advantage of this to change the way we do things, like an abattoir, more robotics and technology, and ensuring worker safety and improving what we've got. That I think the wrong answer to this would be what we hope for in the future is to go back to the way it was. I think this is an opportunity, and this is a way to move forward as well.
Thanks, Beth. How about you? What are your thoughts about what you'd like to see and how we could get there?
So I would say that there's actually a lot of potential for innovation and expansion. So for example, Arvinder's point about finding ways to support farmers in online ordering platforms and helping with tech support and setup for that is critical, because a lot of farmers don't have time to develop those skills themselves, and having like meaningful engagement and support would be very helpful. So I think the trick to supporting the diversity of the farm industry is to pay attention to that diversity, and to make resources and supports available in meaningful ways to different kinds of farmers in different geographical areas who have different needs and challenges. So the supports that a smaller scale mixed use farm is going to need are very different from some of those needed in other agricultural sectors, and we need to pay attention to that. Some of the current discussions we've seen around expansion of rural access to high-speed internet, for example, will be critical to some farmers, and this is a meaningful change both now and for the future of their operations. We need governments to show that they value the range of farming out there, and that they support a space for that range of farming. I also think that the COVID-19 situation has the potential to get more of us thinking critically about things like supply chains and production and processing, the labor and the environmental contexts of how our food is produced, how many hands it passes through, and who gets access to things like locally produced foods. This is, it involves community and political engagement and pushing hard for policy and action that supports equitable access to local foods as part of strengthening food security overall. So I see right now as having the potential to continue the fight for equitable food access while supporting and building on a smaller scale and other farms during uncertain times and for the future.
Thanks. Arvinder, how about you? What are some of your thoughts on this?
I think that, we need a system-wide solution. Our food system is complex, and it's made up of, interconnected chains, and we're gonna need solutions for, various communities, various institutions. We could start off with, food waste from farm to fork. We're gonna need better policies for marginalized communities. I think that we're going to need to invest in agricultural technology, storage, and we also need to start talking about poverty alleviation. And that all looks, different for different groups. It's all context and site specific. I think that we need to start promoting farmers who use agroecology practices, and we need to incorporate food sovereignty principles. And I've been a real big, activist for, food literacy programs, especially, bringing gardeners to high schools and middle schools. I think we need to start, creating an ecological mindset, at younger ages and teaching people about sustainability. We need a cultural shift, and I think food should be a universal right. How do we do this? Well, we need to make sure that science is brought to action. We need to bring researchers, policymakers, and private organizations to work in parallel. And we need to start bridging cross-cultural communication, just like getting everyone to talk and bringing everyone to the table, which I think these webinar series are doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. And Letitia, how about you?
Yeah, so just to add to what Arvinder and Beth also shared, I think, during COVID, when the government started announcing the funding supports and programs, we all saw that a lot of the financial supports were, again, to big agribusinesses, and very little sort of left over for small scale growers and even to think about Black and Indigenous growers within that context, or even urban agriculture as well within that context, which I don't think is valued in the same way. So I think we need to decentralize the way that our food system is set up around agribusinesses and really look at supporting small scale growers, but specifically looking at the fact that Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people do not have access to land in the same way. So how do we create programs specifically to support Black, Indigenous, and racialized people within agriculture, and also making a good chunk of our federal and provincial funding to support small scale growers, I think is one key piece that we really, really need to look at. The other piece I wanted to add is the increase of wages. I'm a huge supporter of the 15 and Fairness campaign. Of course, I'm sure it's like $20 an hour now that people really need to live in any decent way. So I think really increasing wages for farmers, especially migrant worker farmers, making sure that they get permanent status upon entrance, because that's what is going to allow them to be able to access health benefits that they already pay into. I think it's also important. And then looking at housing for migrant farm workers, once they arrive, is also crucial and is important and is imperative to their health as well. And I think, going back, because I'm involved in urban agriculture, and I think it's high time that we do look at urban agriculture as playing a key role within our food system and within our local food system, for the fact that, again, over 60% of the world population live in urban centers. So what are the ways that urban farms or urban farms, urban gardens can also align themselves with rural, small scaleholder farms to really push some of these forward? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, we've had a number of questions coming into our Q&A box. So I'm going to start with a couple of them and see if some of the panelists want to tackle them. There are a couple questions that I'm going to put together around some issues of sort of the cost of food. One person is asking how we balance the increased costs of improving the food system, particularly the labor issues, and the fact that cost of food for those, and the fact that there's a problem with cost of food for those who don't have financial access. So is basic income the answer? Another person has certainly gone on the cost of food as well, saying to pay farmers more and pay our seasonal workers more doesn't make sense to ask consumers to pay more for the food on the shelves. Is the average consumer shopping at the grocery store for the food not paying enough. So I think there's sort of those two sides, that on the one hand, we need to support the food production system, pay the workers appropriately, give them appropriate supports, which will likely raise the cost of foods, and perhaps food is relatively cheap in some ways already, and yet we have many people who already can't afford the foods. And so what are your thoughts on that? Does somebody want to start with that?
I could start. I think we have a concentration of wealth, right? The food industry globally is a trillion, right? Trillions of trillion industry, but the money is concentrated at the top. And so then when you come to the bottom, you have farmers and the growers at the bottom, or the people that are processing the food, that are not gaining from the whole wealth as well. So I think we really need to look at the way the pyramid that is set up within our food system, and the way that we can share the wealth. Like, why should one company or one family own so much of the food system that we eat? If food is based on profit and the profit is only shared at the very top, we're gonna have this problem that we're having. So yes, I don't agree that, you know, the cost should be put on consumers. I think that we really need to look at the way that the whole structure of the food system is set up, and really look at ways that can shift to make sure that you know, the wealth is shared evenly across the board, so that people, one, have access to the food that they eat, but also the wealth is circulating among people, specifically among the people who are actually growing the food on the ground.
Thank you. Beth, do you want to weigh in on this one around sort of financially supporting both people working in the farm system and the food production system adequately, but also ensuring that consumers, particularly vulnerable consumers, are able to get the food that they need?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I agree with Letitia that we're not seeing an even distribution of the profits that come from food production, although that's very, you know, diverse depending on the industry that we're talking about. Things like the cost of processing of livestock can really affect, you know, the income that farmers make. And that is shaped by things like the consolidation of processing centers. I also think that the cost of food issue is, it's not just about the cost of food itself, it's also about the wages that are being made outside of the food sector as well. So people's salaries and living wages are critical to ensuring that people have access to, or are able to afford good, culturally appropriate, nutritious, and valued foods, the foods that people want to be able to eat and access. So whether that's through a basic income or sort of a concerted effort, well, not just effort, but an, you know, specific action to ensure that people are being paid living wages. You know, there are different ways to address this, but I really do think it is partly about what people are earning and whether they're earning a living wage.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. Alice Rain has asked, for consumers, do panelists have any advice on how we can act to improve food insecurity? Should we be acting local? Other suggestions for consumers? Arvinder, can I start with you on that one?
Absolutely, yeah. So from the student end, I would say we should all start gardening in our backyards. I know a lot of my colleagues and fellow students are currently taking part in, you know, this backyard, you know, adventure. I've actually started growing microgreens in my garage, and I also have a decent, you know, garden in the backyard, and I'm using my microgreens to make paranthas, which is Indian food. It's like chapati or rotis, and you just mix it in within the dough, and it makes this this amazing bread dough that you eat with other lentils or or like yogurt. But yeah, I would say start acting local, start supporting your, your local farmers, start, because that just reinvests all the money back into the community. Yeah, I think just like we need to like educate ourselves. There's a lot being thrown at us right now. There's a lot being thrown at us right now. And I think it's just, start asking, just take a step back and just like take a breather and try and do the most you can right now. We are in a pandemic. What else? I think I'll chime back in if I think of something else. Yeah.
Great. If anybody else has something they want to add on that, just go ahead. Otherwise, I will move on to another question from Jeff Wichtel. This is a policy question. So he says, as bad as this pandemic has been, the next one could necessitate more severe movement control of food products across borders and even within provinces. So to assure Canadians' food security during future emergencies, what is the single most influential policy request we could make of governments today while COVID is still fresh in our minds? Bob, do you want to tackle that one to start with?
Not really, because it's a really tough question. I don't think anybody has the real answer, but some of the, as a veterinarian, some of our policies about closing borders, because, if there's a disease outbreak in Newfoundland, the Canadian border closes, and yet, you can't ship pigs from Manitoba to Minnesota because of an issue in Newfoundland, where politics gets in the way and borders cause problems. And so that's one of the disease problems, is being able to create a way of regionalizing, and just like in Ontario today, we've got Toronto and Hamilton being treated a little differently than rural or other areas in Ontario, because the danger is different, and international policy has not been like that. One case of mad cow disease in Alberta closes the whole border, that's not really rational. I think governments take advantage of this sometimes just to create barriers to help their own, farmers maybe, or something. But I don't know if that answers Jeff's question, but it's my best guess.
Well, as you say, it's a really difficult question, and no clear answer. I'm wondering if any of the other panelists have other sort of comments on particularly policy requests that we could be making to government. It might not so much be about, moving food products across borders and so on, but, what would your request to government be on the policy end to address food security during emergencies? Beth, yeah, go ahead.
I agree with Bob that this is a really hard question, because I'm not sure that there is one single policy that would address this. In fact, I'm sure there isn't. But I do think that I would like to see more infrastructure readily available within smaller distances, right? So that we don't have to necessarily ship livestock for processing it to long distances to huge abattoirs. So we could perhaps be looking at smaller scale abattoirs that are a little bit closer, and in the event of a pandemic, can be more quickly monitored and set up for health and safety pandemic regulations and things like that. So rather than a sort of more decentralized perspective, rather than a more centralized perspective, I'd like to see more decentralization of some of the infrastructure that is critical to a range of farmers. And I think that puts us in a potentially better position should we see significant restrictions being placed on the movement of food products and the things that we need to support the food production.
Thank you. One question that's come in that is very close to my own interests is, what are we doing to educate consumers to make wiser choices in food purchases, which would help offset potential increase in food prices? We have abandoned teaching this in school. And so sort of overall, I know Arvinder, you had mentioned food literacy. And so, you know, what suggestions and thoughts do you have about food education for consumers?
Ooh. Well, food education, it doesn't have to be a formalized, institutionalized thing. I think we need to start, you know, promoting it within our households as well, where we, you know, learning is not just done in institutions and at universities, it's also done at home. And I think that we need to start promoting at-home education. My grandparents taught me a lot about farming. I come from a long line of farmers, generational farmers from Punjab, India. They've all taken the time out of their day to, you know, explain to me the significance of food, of you know, making your own food, growing your own food, and trying to promote your local food system. And you know, it's just there's right now, as Letitia mentioned earlier, the pyramid is upside down and needs to be more of a circle. And there's been a cool initiative that started up in Guelph. We actually got a grant, $10 million grant from the government, from Impact Canada. And that was for the circular food economy concept. So it just means that we're supporting, we're getting food within the system, but we're not losing any of its resources, and we're trying to reinvest and somehow put the waste back into the system somehow and make it more circular, make it more sustainable. And I've had the first-hand experience of witnessing all of this happening at the Seed Social Enterprise, which is I mentioned earlier, it's a social enterprise in Guelph, where they grow their own food and they have their own farms, where they employ at-risk youth and senior citizens, sold at a mobile food market around the community for marginalized community members as well, on a sliding scale. And whatever food does not get sold, it gets upcycled within their upcycled kitchen, where senior citizens and at-risk youth come and volunteer and make these delicious dishes. And then that's food is sold, and whatever's not sold, they just donate it, and they just, like, you know, try and make the most of it. And I think that, you know, we start teaching concepts of sustainability within schools, food literacy. There's a lot that goes within it. Canada's food guide, you know, had a lot of points in terms of food literacy and why it's important, and some of the steps that education institutions need to take. But I think it's also a lot, you know, self-learning at home, because, you know, you learn in different ways. Everyone learns in different ways.
Great. Letitia, do you have anything to add particularly to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add, in terms of food education for consumers, I think in our community, for the most part, I always say, like, our aunties knows how to stretch, you know, a small amount of money that they have, and knows how to prepare some of the best, healthiest food you could ever imagine. And I don't think in that context, for low income, Black, Indigenous, racialized folks, that's sort of the issue. The issue is systemic, right? So you work all your years, 30 years in Canada, you have nothing to retire to. You don't have the luxury to fly to Florida or for the winter, right? So you learn in different ways how to manage your resources very well. So I think in our community is more of looking at the systemic issues that are impacting them, that is making it hard in terms of that's having an impact in terms of their food choices, and also in terms of their health.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask a question that has a more global focus, and it's, what lessons do you think the Canadian food system can offer to the world in terms of best practice, and what is our responsibility to the global community in terms of food insecurity? Bob, do you want to give a little start on that, and I'll ask some other people as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question that kind of, as people were talking about growing local and concentrating on supporting the local farmers, etc. Yeah, I have some disagreement with that in that we're part of a globe and we are food producers and have we're a very wealthy country and have a responsibility to try and help the rest of the world. And most famines have been a result of eating local, that they haven't been able to access food from, it often is a local phenomena. It's a war, a climate catastrophe, and we need to be able to keep borders open and move products. And I should stop there and let everybody else speak.
Thank you. Beth, any thoughts that you have on Canada's responsibility to the global community?
Yeah, and I think it is important to recognize that it's not a sort of local food or global food only, that we need to balance. There are things that we can't grow in Canada. There are things that we grow really well in Canada that other people can't, and so that it is important to contribute to the global food system and be part of that discussion and part of the practice, not simply focus only on local production. But there is also a place for local production that does need to be supported. So I think, what is our responsibility to the global community in terms of food insecurity? I would say our responsibility as a country is to ensure that we have farmers who are able to farm, right? That farming is a livelihood and an industry that allows for people to support their families and do the kinds of work that they want to in a way that is rewarding to them, and that is supported by the government, so that it doesn't become a situation where only certain people who have the resources or the who inherit the land or and whatnot can farm. It shouldn't just be sort of that consolidation. We as a country need to create and ensure spaces for the expansion and the sustainability of food production in this country.
Thanks. Letitia, do you have something to add to that?
I just wanted to quickly to respond to Bob's argument in regards to the famine. I think, and I think when we're looking at famine and local food systems, predominantly in whether it be on the continent of Africa or in parts of Asia, they always have direct links to foreign entities that are either coming in, mining, extracting resources, or wars and things that are created that create sort of some of the challenges and issues that these countries or these communities end up having. So that was just the one point that I wanted to add, that like these famines, whether it be, or droughts, whether it be climate change, all have, all are very much related globally to how different countries or different entities are interacting or are coming in to loot or to extract resources, right? So I think it's important to always make that connection, that these things don't happen on their own. There are always connections with other entities as well. That was just the only part I wanted to add.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody. We are out of time here. So unfortunately, we are going to have to end it there. But I do want to really thank all of the panelists. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of diverse perspectives. We could have gone on a lot longer, I think, and continued this discussion. Also, a lot of great questions that we weren't able to get to as well. But You've certainly stimulated our thoughts from this. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the Arrow Food Institute Food from Thought and One Health sites at the University of Guelph. Also want to let people know that the next webinar in this series will be a week from today, Tuesday, June 16th from 11 till noon again, and it will be on ag, tech, and labor. And the registration information will be sent out to everybody on that. So with that, I will say goodbye to everybody. And again, thank you for attending. Thank you to the panelists for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.